So as America and Israel continue their war with Iran into a 12th day, it would be understandable for most people to think they already know the military and economic stories behind this region-wide conflict. As the war continues, the unpredictability, the military escalations, the missile exchanges, all with Iran threatening the Strait of Hormuz, causing oil price spikes, fluctuations, and therefore energy markets panicking. But those explanations may actually be missing a deeper point. Because the biggest impact of this war may not be to the disruption of oil itself, but what the disruption does to the already fragile and unpredictable global economy. Simply put, the real danger isn't in one single energy shock. It's the chain reaction that shock could trigger indefinitely. Economists already warned that this war is unleashing a global economic, what's known as a butterfly effect, where one regional conflict sends ripples through inflation, supply chains, financial markets, and eventually even more into households than have already been on the receiving end right now. And so if that's true, then this war may be revealing something far more important than any temporary oil crisis. It may be exposing just how fragile the global economy has become because of our integration, but also the fragmentation as we try to decouple, de-risk, or go into spheres of influence in this ever disorderly system. With that in mind, I wanted to have a greater exploration of to what is exactly going on here, why it matters for the medium short term, but also the longer term in the structural effects, and how it could play out depending upon the decisions made by not just a couple of countries, but a couple of individuals. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel where we are exploring the Iran war from a specific angle, the geoeconomics and the energy security. I like to take a specific dive into one angle. You can find videos on China's perspective, Russia's, the overall sustainability of this conflict in the past week and a half. But in this case, I also am curious for your thoughts. How much do you think that this could be a lingering structural reset in the overall economic system? If enough reserves can be released, then maybe it won't be as bad. A lot of speculation, a lot of differing opinions. Be sure to share yours in the comments below. Now, to understand why this war matters economically, if it wasn't already obvious, you have to start with geography. The Strait of Hormuz, this narrow waterway that you've heard countless times already, it connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. 20% of globally traded oil passes through it, and it makes it one of the strategically most important choke points in the entire global economy. But it's also a pressure point not just for the Gulf states or for China, as many people emphasize, but for Iran itself. If Iran is to close or attempt to keep this place closed, well, it will of course have negative repercussions for the Iranian regime as well. So when Iran began shipping and threatening tankers moving through the strait, the impact on energy markets was immediate. Oil prices have surged as high as $120, but of course they've come down to around 80. Now, as of today of recording, they're at 101, peaking. Very volatile. And that's one of the biggest concerns, more than spikes and then dips, is how much that keeps happening. Even after political signals from Washington have briefly pushed these prices lower, exactly, the reality on the water quickly has forced them back up again. And this is why the situation becomes so dangerous. Because the global economy today may be actually much more sensitive to oil shocks than people realize. 1970s, for example, the oil crisis caused economies to burn oil for electricity generation. Today, that happens far less often. But oil demand is now extremely concentrated in sectors where substitution is difficult, particularly transport and petrochemicals. That means when supply suddenly falls short, prices must rise much more sharply in order to balance that demand. And in this case, the disruption is extreme. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has removed a massive amount of supply from the market, a shock potentially larger than the oil crises of the 1970s, or OPEC crisis of 73 specifically. Under a scenario where the strait remains closed for an extended period, some people estimate that oil prices could exceed $150 a barrel. And that would ripple through the entire global economy, perhaps having the same level of sustained inflation that we've seen since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is where the economic chain reaction begins. Economists are warning that this war could trigger what they describe as this butterfly effect. In fragile economic systems, small shocks cascade into much larger consequences. You may have heard the term from Jurassic Park, for example. And right now, the global economy is very fragile from the numerous different segregated events that all intertwine, if you consider who's behind a lot of them or has an influence in a lot of them. Inflation has proven stubbornly difficult to bring down ever since the pandemic. The US labor market, for example, has been cooling, and consumers are becoming much more cautious with their spending. Global debt levels remain historically high, and many people emphasize that they're simply unsustainable. So then layer an energy shock on top of that, which has been a bit of a reprieve in recent years. Well, according to some forecasts, therefore, the war continuing for several weeks and the Strait of Hormuz remaining partially disrupted, be that closed or whatever way you want to interpret it, oil prices, therefore, they may eventually stabilize. But those overall higher prices, the baseline price level is just overall higher. So that scenario alone pushes inflation back upward later this year. And that scenario, therefore, means that we all suffer overall, be that at the pump or in the shops or in our gas bills at home. But if the war drags on for several months and energy infrastructure suffers sustained damage, let alone the disruption to maritime flows, well, that makes it even worse. Oil prices could remain above this $150 barrel level into next year, which in that environment, inflation climbs above 4%, which in the United States, that's not really seen since the pandemic and isn't something that any economy that doesn't have massive growth can really manage very well. And the global economy recovery then stalls overall. Then there's, of course, the strategic twist. Iran does not need to defeat the US militarily to inflict the serious damage. That's the point I've been making from the beginning, is that it only needs to exploit economic pressure points. And energy is the biggest one of all. Over the past 2 weeks, Iranian forces have launched drone and missile strikes targeting shipping lanes, energy facilities, and infrastructure specifically across the Gulf. Some of these attacks have been remarkably low-tech, the cheap drones, the simple missiles. They're not sophisticated weapons, they're not smart weapons. But the economic impact has been enormous and revealed the strategy that the Iranians have clearly been retaining to use in the worst-case scenario. The cost of launching this attack is extremely low, but the cost of defending it is incredibly high. Drones used can be 20 grand versus the intercept missiles, which are 4 million, and often you need more than one. And so this creates a brutal economic imbalance, not simply because of the destruction to the Iranian economy, but because of the sustainability for the American to supply this war. In the opening phases of the conflict, Iran launched a large array of these drones and missiles towards Gulf targets. Now, the air defense systems intercepted most of them, but of course each interception consumes these expensive missiles and depletes the stockpiles, of which Qatar and the Emirates have made very clear they're running out of. So all of this therefore brings us to the Gulf itself, as this conflict has exposed something else about them. The underlying vulnerability of the Gulf economies is much higher than we initially thought. For decades, countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have invested heavily in projecting these images of stability. Dubai in particular has been a global hub where finance, business, tourism, logistics operate safely despite the turmoil of the wider Middle East, as a tax haven, as a place of refuge, of an oasis. But the war has really punctured that image, and the drone strikes having hit airports, ports, infrastructure across energy is really undermining their ability for them to get a hold of it. The Gulf states operate under a specific social contract, you could argue, that their governments promise this prosperity, the security, the stability in exchange for the political loyalty and a degree of sort of reduced freedoms relative to Western liberal democracies. But sustained conflict threatens that bargain, and therefore you see millions of people considering whether they want to remain, thousands already leaving. Global investors rely on these Gulf logistics as hubs, and energy buyers depend on the region as a reliable supplier, not just as individuals, but as entire nation states. If that perception of stability erodes, the economic consequences could last far longer than the war does in terms of people's unwillingness to return. But moreover, oil is only part of the story. The war has triggered major disruptions across natural gas markets as well. Qatar's main liquefied natural gas export facility, the largest LNG complex in the world, mind you, was struck by drones just only a couple of days into it. So the attack forced the facility to just completely shut down and remove nearly 20% of global LNG supply in a moment. The consequences, though, linger much higher. Asian buyers are continuing to scramble to secure alternative shipments. European gas prices have surged and remained almost 50% higher, Germany, Italy and England being the biggest affected. And storage levels across broader Europe were already unusually low for this time of year. So in theory, the US could increase LNG exports to stabilize the markets, but even that solution has limits, because domestic American gas demand is rising rapidly due to the explosion of energy-hungry data centers that power AI and cloud computing. In other words, there is far less spare capacity in the global gas system than many policymakers have assumed and anyone was ready for in the case of a major regional conflict in the Middle East. We often think about World War III being involving nukes, but in this case, it is very much around the impact on technological sustainability and usage. Once energy prices begin rising, the effects quickly cascade through the broader economy. Transport costs increase, supply chains slow down, air travel becomes more expensive, shipping insurances costs surge, inflation begins to climb and remain sticky. But the real danger, therefore, relies on what happens next, encompassing all of those factors. Because oil production can't simply be turned off and on like a switch. When wells are shut down or infrastructure is significantly damaged, bringing production back online takes time, usually months. There's a huge lag time effect, and this means that even if the war were to end tomorrow, the economic aftershocks will last months longer, possibly a year, depending upon how far this goes. Couple that with high inflation, which could force central banks to delay interest cuts, and therefore growth slows. You become stagnant, and the fears or sense that maybe America wasn't going to enter a recession. And so governments across the world, especially in Europe, may once again face a rather similar dilemma that they faced when the Ukrainian war fully took off, the immediate energy crisis. Do they allow energy prices to surge and risk political backlash? Or do they spend enormous sums subsidizing households and businesses, economic capital, financial, political? The United States can project overwhelming military force, but of course they cannot ensure the stability of energy markets during any crisis. They can't defend every tanker and they can't guarantee every shipping lane. They can't be everywhere at once. And it cannot easily prevent, therefore, as in the United States, low-cost drones from periodically disrupting infrastructure. Even if there were a relatively drawdown of the conflict, with continued airstrikes no longer being a thing, the Islamic Republic, the IRGC, can use these disruptive methods, what they've always relied on, relatively speaking. Means the threat of energy disruption may now become a just permanent reoccurring feature of geopolitical competition, especially in the Middle East, in these high-value supply links and supply chain areas. If Iran concludes that disrupting the global economy gives it any form of leverage over the United States, then it will just simply return to that tactic on a recurring basis. And other countries will always be watching closely about who's really at fault or sustaining the overall global imbalance. The war between the US, Israel and Iran may eventually wind down militarily. We are seeing continued suggestions of that. But the economic consequences are going to linger with us for a long time now. The global supply chains will have to permanently adjust, and investors and those who determine where money flows are again recalculating the relevance of geopolitical risk, something that I emphasize a lot on this channel. Governments have to confront the possibility of a perma-crisis of energy insecurity, and an uncomfortable reality that the world economy is entering another new phase. But with that, everyone, that's it from me. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and be sure to subscribe for future updates, including some exciting live podcasts I've had and some continuing collaborations with familiar channels as well. But we'll see you all next time. Take care.